Welcome to Macon Memories. I'm Linda Wright at Randolph-Macon College. Today is April 20th, 2023, and I'm here with retired Professor George Spagna. George, welcome back to Macon Memories.
Thank you for inviting me.
We interviewed George for Macon Memories in June of 2009 with Anthony Keat. And in that interview, both George and Anthony had been active in town council, and George has since been mayor, and they talked a lot about town and gown relations, but we didn't have a chance to talk specifically about the Keeble Observatory at Randolph-Macon or the astrophysics major and minor in general. So today, George has graciously agreed to come back and talk specifically about the astronomy program at the college and the Keeble Observatory, as this is a big anniversary year. So I'm going to let George do most of the talking, but before we get started, I would like for him to remind us how and when you came to Randolph-Macon College, to give us a little bit of context for your speaker today.
Thanks, Linda. I actually interviewed twice at the college. My first encounter was the year I was still finishing up my doctorate at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. I was working as a full-time member of the support staff in the physics department and doing the PhD part-time. I interviewed for a sabbatical replacement position. Professor Bill Hesse was getting ready to go on sabbatical, and they had a senior who was interested in astronomy, and Bill at the time had been teaching the astronomy courses, and he wasn't going to be available, so they wanted somebody with an astronomy background to come in. So I did come down for an interview. Bill Hesse put his arm around my shoulder and said, you know, the only way this turns into a tenure track slot is if I kill myself while I'm on sabbatical. They offered me the position. One of the things I learned when I came down to interview was that the college didn't have the sufficient computing resources for me to finish my work, so I had to turn down the offer. I was very surprised a year later to see that they were advertising a tenure track position in the physics department, and I learned when I came down for that interview that Bill Hesse had died about 2 weeks after he started his sabbatical. So there was a vacancy for a tenure track appointment. I came down to interview. I was, in fact, offered the position, so I started in fall of 1986, which seems a long time ago. It's even longer. From my perspective, I retired in 2021 after 35 years of full-time teaching. During that time, I taught all the astronomy, most of the astronomy courses. I can get into that when we're talking about the history of the department. But I maintained operations in the observatory. I started lobbying almost immediately after I got here for a new observatory, pointing out that the facility at that time was old, and it was built in what had been a dark corner of the campus, and subsequently the three-story science building just south of it, and more campus lights. And so I was told several times by then President Liddell Payne that it wasn't a priority, but if somebody came up with the money, they would be happy to accept it. So taught physics and astronomy here for 35 years. I spent 16 of those years as chair of the physics department. One of the hires shortly after I got here, I hired a gentleman named Jim Borgwald, who also had a background in astronomy, and Jim and I started collaborating with the idea, well, maybe we should offer a more upper-level version of astronomy courses, and we crafted what came to be the astrophysics minor. By the time it was fully instituted, of course, Jim had left the college. He went to Lincoln University in in Missouri. But we continued with the astrophysics minor, which consists of the introductory courses in physics and calculus, of course, 2 theory courses in astrophysics, a course called the Historical and Philosophical Foundations of Astronomy, and then an observational astronomy course. And from the day it started, we always had students enrolled. I don't think that program has ever gone without at least a handful of students doing the minor. And long story short, when they got the funding to build the new Brock laboratory building for chemistry and environmental studies and biology. I told, at that time the president was Bob Lindgren, and I told Bob, I said, you've just destroyed what's left of my southern horizon. We have to build a new observatory. I had already had an offer from Hanover Academy, which is about 5 miles from campus, to let us build an observatory in their huge, empty, unlit back field. And so we had that in our hip pocket, and Bob Lindgren started looking for donors. We were in the middle of a capital campaign anyway. So they added an observatory to the list of possible donations. He approached a couple who had given money to the college arts program, and the college had even awarded them honorary doctorates, Mariah and Peter Rippey. And he approached them and asked if they would be interested in funding an observatory, and they said no. They'd continue funding the arts, but the observatory wasn't their thing. Turns out that they are both aficionados of a gentleman named Richard Rohr, who's, I believe, a Franciscan monk. He's a Catholic priest, and he has a wide following, and they have conferences in New Mexico either every year or every other year. So Mariah and Peter were at a Richard Rohr conference in New Mexico, and there was an astronomy convention in the same hotel. And being curious people, they crashed a couple of the sessions, and when they came back to Virginia, they called up the development office and said, is that observatory still a possibility? So Diane Lauder and I took them to lunch, and we told them what we had in mind, and they said, sure. And 2 weeks later, they called up and said, but we would like it on campus. So the new Keeble Observatory, which they funded to the tune of about $500,000, it was not a minor investment. The new telescope alone was $95,000 of that. But we cast around on campus for a location, and head of physical plant came to me scratching his head and said, we can't figure out where to put this. And I said, I'll show you exactly where to put it. And we walked off the north end of the Copley Science Center, and I said, you put it here. You go up 2 stories and put the observatory on top of that. And that is the current location of the Keeble Observatory. The Rippeys, unlike a lot of, we have, 3 buildings named after Macon Brock. We've got the Brock Commons, the Brock Center, and the new Brock Laboratory building. And I understand that Macon's wife said, no more Brock buildings. But we could have been the Rippey Observatory, but they said, no, we don't want our name on it. It's always been the Keeble Observatory, so let's keep the name. So that's the new Keeble Observatory. We tore down the old observatory in 2016, and the new observatory was built. Formal dedication and the event we call First Light was in November of 2017, for which I invited one of my former students who got a PhD in astrophysics to come back and be the keynote. She subsequently was offered a job by Bob Lindgren to work in development, managing the Brock Innovation Fund, and she has subsequently left the college, and she married and has a young son, and other than that, I've really lost track of Kate, but I always remember when she came for her talk. She didn't talk about astronomy at the dedication of the observatory. She talked about the value of liberal arts education.
Wonderful.
Yeah, I thought she contacted me and said, you think it would be okay if I contact President Lindgren and see if he can give me some connections in Virginia because I want to move back from Indiana. And I said, Kate, let me be honest with you. You knocked his socks off. If you tell him you're looking for a job, he'll offer you one, and he did. So Kate's the only one of my former students who got a PhD in astrophysics. I've had several go on and do work in astrophysics. Haley Williamson, now Haley Williamson Dove, got her PhD at UVA, but they told her she would probably be more effective if instead of calling it planetary science, you call it engineering physics. And she's currently doing a postdoc in Sweden. So Haley is another astrophysics student. But anyway, I'm not here to talk about my former students. I'm here to talk about astronomy in the Keeble Observatory.
I do want to thank you, George. I do want to interrupt real briefly to say we are so grateful to the Rippeys for that generous donation. But I also want to just say for the record that you and your wife were also early donors to the observatory and kind of kickstarting that campaign. So thank you for that.
You're very welcome. It's in a certain sense, it's my physical legacy at the college to have that.
Yes. So a couple of things I want. You want to keep telling us about the history of the observatory. Would you like to talk any specifics about the new observatory or the old, or is that too technical?
Let me talk about the old Keeble Observatory, and then I'll talk about the new Keeble Observatory, which I not only got it kick-started by bugging people, but I also worked with the architects who designed it to make sure that it would meet our needs. In 1960, this is going back, obviously this is the 60th anniversary of the Keeble Observatory. This is going back 3 further years. The college received the gift of a 12-inch telescope from a gentleman named Foy Hibbard. Foy Hibbard was the chief meteorologist for the Weather Bureau in Richmond. I understand from further reading that his office was at Chimborazo Park in Richmond. Foy Hibbard was a collaborator with a gentleman named J.C. Vaughn. I haven't been able to learn what the initials stand for, but J.C. Vaughn was an amateur telescope builder in Petersburg, and they collaborated a little on telescope design. Foy Hibbard was interested in how could you design a telescope, a reflecting telescope in particular, where you would not be subject to air currents, primarily in the telescope itself. And they wrote several papers, and Hibbard built several telescopes. My suspicion, I don't have a document to prove this, but my suspicion is that Hibbard built the telescope, that Vaughn built the telescope that Hibbard donated to the college. I subsequently found an obituary for Foy Hibbard. He died in 1968. He's not originally from the Richmond area, but he lived in the Richmond region for about 15 years with his job at the Weather Bureau. So the so-called Hibbard-Vaughn telescope, we still have the tube and drive for that telescope. It's sitting in Copley Science Center. The telescope was too big to be portable, and there was no place to use it. So they built a small block house on East Patrick Street, just north of what is now the Copley Science Center. And it was, I think some of the fundraising came from the Richmond Astronomical Society, but they don't have any record of that. But they were aware of the observatory. I know that the dome on that observatory was a converted silo cover from a farm. But they built the observatory. They had a 12-inch telescope. They opened the observatory in 1963. It was named after, William Houston Keeble, who taught physics and astronomy at Randolph-Macon College from, I believe, 1918 until 1954.
I've got 1919 to 1952 in my notes, so roughly, that period, yes.
Yeah, he was here a long time. He was here a long, long time. I found an old student newspaper, Yellow Jacket, from 1920, and that was the year of the famous War of the Worlds broadcast. And apparently some students were listening to that broadcast, and one of them was from New Jersey, and he panicked. So a bunch of them went and knocked on Keeble's door and said, "Oh, the Martians are coming." He said, "Come on in, boys." He was listening to Fibber McGee and Molly on a different station, but he switched over to this play. He listened for a few minutes and says, "Relax, boys, it's just a play." And that made the student newspaper. But he taught forever. We have a picture in a display case over in the physics department of Keeble teaching a physics class. And I point out to my students, and this was in a lecture hall in the old Smithy Science Building. That lecture hall has since disappeared, and it's now laboratory space for neuroscience and offices for neuroscience and psychology. But he's at the lecture stage, and with the exception of one display meter, everything on that stage is still in the department. It is still being used. So all those demonstration apparatus still function. But after he retired, one of my friends who was a Randolph-Macon alum says after he retired from the physics department, he became the college treasurer for a couple of years.
Oh, really?
So,
interesting.
Yeah, it's obviously a multi-talented gentleman. But anyway, so the observatory was named after Keeble, which makes it one of the few buildings on campus actually named after a former faculty member. The Blackwell Auditorium is named after a former president, but
And faculty member, longtime
Yeah.
faculty member. What about Smithy? Was he a faculty member?
he may have been.
I think
don't
so.
know that.
But you're right. There.
So, and it's
Yeah.
nice, and it's also nice of the Rippies to keep that name on the
Yes.
building because it's part of the college's legacy. The observatory operated with that Hibbert-Vaughn telescope for a few years, and they realized it wasn't really that good a telescope. So in 1968, they got a small grant from the National Science Foundation, and they bought a different design reflector. It's called a Cassegrain reflector, which, among other things, allows you to have a much smaller telescope tube. The Hibbert-Vaughn telescope tube is about 8 or 9 feet long. The Tinsley 12-inch Cassegrain that they bought, the tube is about 4 feet long. And so they installed that and opened in 1968 at a cost of $6,000. Now remember I told you what the new telescope cost. That was $95,000 in 2017. The observatory operated as a teaching laboratory for the physics department. It supported the astronomy courses. It supported several faculty members, just amateur interests. I'm told that Dick Grove ran the observatory for a while. I know for a fact that Wade Temple ran the observatory for a while. Even so much, I found a record in the physics department that he had, on a sabbatical, he had gone and learned how to teach astronomy. So, he give himself some more skills. I have a story from former faculty member Greg Doherty, also a retiree, longtime faculty member. He says when he first came to the college, Wade Temple asked him if he would like to see the observatory. So they went to the observatory, and Wade's starting to show him some things. As Greg puts it, he said, "Could you wait here a minute?" He said, "Sure." Wade disappeared, came back about 10 minutes later. He says, "Oh, that's better." And Greg says, "What did you do?" "I called up the Holiday Inn and asked them to turn off their sign."
Oh my goodness.
So,
Well, was that just the timing? Did you and Wade Temple overlap?
no. Wade died early 80s,
Okay.
and that's when Bill Hesse became
Okay,
department
so-
chair.
Okay.
I do know, my first year here, the first astronomy course I taught, Wade Temple's son took the course.
Mm-hmm.
Pat Temple, Wade's wife, was a longtime parishioner at St. James the Less here in Ashland. So I met her before I met her son.
Mm-hmm.
And I told Pat that story about Wade. He said, "That sounds like Wade."
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's great. I love that. That's such a small town, small college, just
Exactly.
cooperation.
And this was
call.
before the Ashland Hanover Shopping Center was
Yeah.
there. This was before there were gas stations on that corner. So the light at the Holiday Inn would have been a major light pollution issue for somebody who's serious about looking in that direction. Bill Hesse was teaching astronomy courses. When I first got here, there were notebooks full of his notes, and he had, this technology changes, carousel slide trays full of astronomy slides in sequence. So he could just say, okay, this lecture, those are the slides I want to show, and just pop it into the projector. After after Bill Hesse's death, I believe Emmett Madry took over running the observatory. I do know that I know he was at least the contact person, and he would hire the student assistants to work in the observatory. And I heard one story from Emmett. This is a tale on another late friend of mine, Nina Peace, that Emmett got a phone call on a rainy, cloudy, nasty evening from 9 apiece, who had just showed up at the observatory with a small bunch of Cub Scouts. He says, "What am I supposed to do? I'm here for the public viewing session and the observatory isn't open." And Wade says, "Is it raining there?" "Yes." "So what do you expect me to do? We can't open the observatory, and you should have figured this out all on your own."
She didn't have a backup plan for all those
She didn't have a
8-year-old boys.
Yeah, and her backup plan didn't include tell the parents who bring them to wait and see if this is actually going to happen. So she doesn't have enough vehicles there, and of course that was before the age of cell phones, so she had to go find a payphone so she could call and round up the parents again. I'd say a high point for the observatory, and this is before I actually got here, was Halley's Comet.
Oh. Do you remember what?
85, 86 was the most recent apparition.
Okay.
And it's a once every 75 years event. And they organized public viewing, not just one night a week. They had public viewing every night that it was clear. And I'm told that the lines were around the block.
Wow.
People wanting to see Halley's Comet. Bill Franz, another retiree from the physics department and a former provost, Bill told me a story about there was a young man there with his grandfather, and kid looked at Halley's Comet through the telescope, and grandfather looked, and grandfather says, "See, you come back in 75 years, you'll be able to share this with your grandson." And the kid says, "I'm not standing in line again." So the public viewing program was in place when I first got here. There were students who were running the observatory for public viewing. One of the things they quickly pointed out to me was that the telescope drive wasn't very good. They had learned how to navigate by what we call star hopping. So you'd find your target, but what you had to do, they said, is aim the telescope a few degrees higher than that, then tighten everything up. The telescope will drop a few degrees, and if you're lucky, that's in the field of view. So one of the first things I determined was the observatory needed some work. One of the key characteristics of the old observatory was it had wooden doors, and the bottom 6 inches of the wood had rotted. So if somebody really wanted to, they could, weasel their way into the observatory. I'm supposed to hit the table. Let me back up a little bit so I don't do that inadvertently. My apologies to sound people. The upshot was that the department put together a proposal, one piece of which was to buy a new telescope drive. And casting around for domestic manufacturers of telescopes and telescope drives was not successful. I contacted Tinsley Laboratories, who built the telescope and its drive, and they were no longer making telescopes or doing any support work. I contacted Meade, who are a major supplier of large amateur grade, almost professional grade telescopes, and they wouldn't put a drive under it. I finally, by luck, contacted the University of Wisconsin at Madison because I found out that they had the same telescope. And they told me that they had the same problem, and they were able to get a telescope drive from a company in Japan, Asahi Seiko. So I contacted them, got a price, and we included that price with the renovations for the doors and it would be a need to rebuild the platform because the platform was designed for the old drive. And we put together a package, and Bill Franz, the department chair at the time, put it in as his annual request for educational resources. And the treasurer, Mr. Ball, almost choked. And he finally says, "Okay, we'll give you that, but you don't get any more maintenance money this year." That was the entire maintenance budget for the physics department for that year. So we ordered the telescope drive, we rebuilt the platform. The old drive was taken out with a crane. The new drive was put into the observatory with a crane. We aligned it. The telescope drive is designed for this location because the tilt on the axis of the telescope has to point the telescope to the North Pole. And we only have a couple of degrees wiggle room to adjust that. So if somebody were to buy that telescope drive and say move it to Charlottesville, it wouldn't work. It would not drive properly. But we installed that drive. That drive was $17,000. So we put a $17,000 clock drive under a $6,000 telescope.
About what year was that?
1987.
87,
1987. I was teaching at the time, but Bill Franz was out supervising the work. We did a couple of public special open houses. We did a special open house for 1 year that Mars made an unusually close approach, so we publicized that, and we even got some television coverage, which was neat. I think it was Bill Franz who was with me in the observatory, and one of the television reporters looked through the telescope and said, "Gee, it's really not that impressive." And Bill says, "What do you want? It's 36 million miles away."
Right.
We did some openings for partial solar eclipses. If you mask the telescope down, you basically block off everything except a small aperture, then you can safely use the telescope by projecting an image. If you don't mask the telescope down, the 12-inch mirror will collect so much light energy that it will fry the secondary mirror and it'll explode on you.
Oh my goodness.
So, but we did several of those kinds of events, several comets. I don't remember the dates on these, but there was one surprise comet, I called it, Hyakutake, which was initially discovered only a few weeks before it made its closest approach, but we observed Hyakutake from the Keeble Observatory. It was impressive, more impressive to the naked eye because it wasn't extremely bright, but if you got your eyes dark adapted, the tail stretched 45 degrees across the sky. That was within the same observing season that Hale-Bopp, which was a spectacular bright comet. We did observings for Hale-Bopp. At that time, we had another astronomer in the department, a guy named, now his name escapes me. It'll come back. And he was helping with the observatory, and he quickly learned that where Hale-Bopp was in the sky, it quickly went behind the trees. Well, Bob had his own portable telescope, so when it went behind the trees, he would grab his portable telescope and go set up someplace else on campus, and he'd keep moving the telescope, and the line of people to come to the observatory would just follow him across the campus with his 6-inch telescope.
Now, who was that who had the portable telescope? Oh, this is the person you can't use.
Can't remember.
Oh, I thought you said Bob.
I think, yeah, Olin, I think,
Uh-huh.
but don't quote
No,
me
no,
on that.
that's fine.
Yeah,
I
don't-
just
yeah,
thought you, go ahead.
yeah. But anyway, so,
So the public events.
public events, it's a major outreach for the observatory. We keep an observer's log, and in a typical year, this was in the old observatory, and I've got numbers for the new observatory as well. We could see as many as 300 to 400 visitors come through the observatory from off campus, and that doesn't count on campus. You know, it gets used for the observational astronomy course. It gets used for the intro astronomy course. It gets occasionally used in other courses where people just want to see the sky. I've opened the observatory for environmental studies courses, for example. As I indicated, the facility was torn down in 2016 to make room for staging for the construction of the Brock Laboratory building, but it's also staging for the construction of the new observatory. The new observatory is connected by a footbridge which reaches from the second floor physics offices out to the observatory. The observatory was designed so that it had the same effective horizon as the old observatory. So we have no worse access to the sky than we had from the old observatory. And because of its configuration, it's elevated, so the local lights on campus don't bother us. They did give us a controller where I could shut off the path lights at the Brock building if we needed them off. I don't remember that we've ever done that. it's well enough, it's elevated enough so that we don't have that problem. It's above the street lights.
And you can't call the Holiday Inn and
Can't call the Holiday Inn anymore. It also meant taking down some trees. One of my arguments for building the new observatory was that although we had trimmed them several times, somebody thought it was a brilliant idea back in 1960 to plant willow oaks along East Patrick. 40, 50-year-old willow oaks dominated the northern horizon. We couldn't see the North Star, even if we had the trees topped a few times. So those trees came down. Another tree on Calhoun side of the Copley Science Center came down. The trees that came down were replaced with street trees, which will not grow to be a problem. I was once asked why we put it at the second floor level and why not the third floor? Why not on the roof of Copley? The roof of Copley was compromised. Is compromised by there's a big solar array there. It's also where the chiller plants for the building. And that chiller plant there is more than just cold water to run the air conditioning in Copley. It also provides the cold water air conditioning for Haley and Fox and Blackwell. And so it's a major plant.
Maybe this.
Yeah, it could well be here. When they put a chiller plant on that building, and the first one was basically just for that building, but when they had to replace it, they had put in one with extra capacity so that as AC units failed for other buildings, they could just hook them into this system. Excuse me. The other disadvantage, the only place left to put it, there would be no access because the elevator at Copley stops on the third floor. So they would have had to add an extra floor to the elevator capacity, and then there's a solar array up there now, and that provides a major thermal load in the first few hours after the sun goes down. So that wasn't right. The other advantage of only going up second floor level is that we can't see the lights on the football field. And those stay lit until 9 o'clock. And the scoreboard on the football field is never turned off. So we've solved that light pollution issue at that level. The telescope we bought was from a company in Germany. The telescope was shipped over, and then one of the directors of the company himself came over to install it. Wolfgang Promper or something like that. He flew in from Vienna just to install our telescope. If you go to the Keeble webpage, I think there's still a picture of the observatory. It was taken the night that we finished aligning the new telescope, and you'll see somebody out on the railing. And that's Wolfgang. He stepped out of the observatory to smoke a cigarette. I wouldn't let him smoke in the building. The telescope itself is computer controlled. What that means, I mentioned star hopping for the old telescope. The computer controls on this mean operating through a planetarium software package. You click on the target you want and tell the telescope to go there, and it goes there.
Wow.
Subsequent to opening the observatory, we had a second mini capital campaign to which I contributed to automate the dome so that the dome would follow the telescope rather than having to be manually. I understand that has been misaligned since I left, and I keep encouraging folks, look in the files, you'll find the alignment procedure to get it so it works again. One of the advantages of a fully automated dome is you can operate the telescope in fully remote mode. You could send commands to the observatory, turn on the telescope, start the motors, open the dome, select your target, and go. You can even program the whole thing so that it will do it without anybody having to give the commands. You can say, watch this target for this amount of time, this target for this amount of time, and so on. The dome also has it especially useful for fully automatic mode. It has a feature that it can tell the weather. There's a rain-snow sensor on the outside of the dome, and if it detects rain or snow, it closes the dome in 10 seconds.
That's great.
So don't have to worry about it raining on your parade.
Yeah.
Other things that we have done in my time at the college, then I'll loop back and get into a little more history. I had a student, Scott Lansdale, I believe, who had an interest in radio astronomy. So we did a couple of little projects simulating radio astronomy, and he decided he'd like to build a radio telescope. So we did. We acquired a 10-foot satellite dish, and we converted it into a radio telescope. We mounted that next to the observatory. It was controlled from inside. We bought the receivers from a company that made receivers, and we told them our specifications, and they put in a heavy-duty preamp so that we get the signal in. And so we did a number of years of radio observations. That telescope observed at a wavelength of 21 centimeters, which is, technical terms, that's the wavelength of the hyperfine transition in the ground state of hydrogen, which means that the telescope could be used over time to map the location of hydrogen in the galaxy. It was used for solar observations. I had a student who did a summer research project where he used the telescope to track the sun, and he correlated outbursts of 21 centimeter radiation from the sun with solar flares. So the title of his presentation was Observing the Sun, Looking at the Sun. Subtext, don't look at the sun. He subsequently went on, it was Austin Bander. He went out and started his own environmental consulting company, Bander Smith, which now specializes in evaluating, remediating, and designing and building dam structures. So he took an interest in astrophysics and turned it into on-the-ground engineering. I had another student, and I'm terrible with names, I forget his name, who had an interest in radio astronomy but wasn't interested in using the existing telescope, which we had dubbed it the Center of the Universe Radio Telescope, CURT. Had another student, he was interested in radio astronomy but wasn't interested in using CURT. He wanted to build his own. So on the roof of Copley at that time, we built a frame out of PVC piping, and we installed our second radio telescope, CURT-2. This was what's called a phased dipole array, and it observed not at 21 centimeters, but at long wavelengths, 10 to 20 meter wavelengths, which made it suitable for observing the sun, but also for observing the radiation cloud around planets like Jupiter. So we built this array, and so at one time we were operating 2 radio telescopes.
Wow.
When it was time for the solar array to come in, that was, as I understand the agreement, the building roof was leased to Dominion Virginia Energy.
The roof of Copley.
Yeah, on the roof of Copley.
Okay.
That lease, it was leased to them. They wanted to do a test. They wanted to put in a 50 kilowatt array and test batteries for storing energy to be distributed when the sun wasn't shining. And so if you look at Copley now, on the north end, there's this bricked-in enclosure. That's where they kept swapping in and out test batteries for that array. But putting the array up there meant that CURT-2 had to go. The department still has all the wiring and the antennas, and it could be, if somebody really wanted to, throw it in the back of a car and go out in the middle of an open field and set it up and take observations running the radio telescope off the car battery. But CURT-2 went away when that solar array came in. CURT-1 went away when we took down the observatory in 2016. Somewhere I still have pictures on my phone of a backhoe taking down the radio telescope, and ripping the dome off the observatory, knocking the walls down. The week before we knocked it down, we had a crane come in so we could take the old telescope drive out. The telescope itself at that time, the Tinsley telescope, only weighed 75 pounds, so 2 people could easily detach it from the drive and carry it in. The telescope drive was 600 pounds, so it went in and out with a crane. And the crane operator was very generous. Dwayne Berger, who often does photography for the college, had been hired to come in and photograph to document the demolition, the removal of the dome. And he wanted to shoot it from two different angles. He wanted a ground level observation. He wanted one from the windows of Copley so he could look down on it. And the crane operator very obligingly did it twice.
Oh, that's great.
Take it up, set it down. Okay, those are not pictures. Put it back in. Okay, try it again.
Oh, that's great.
So anyway, that drive came out and the observatory came down, and for the following academic year, when we did not have access to the observatory, the physics department laid in a dozen heavy-duty astronomical binoculars and tripods, so I was still able to do the observational components of my courses. We would just go set up in an open field and do the observations from there. The department still has all the binoculars and tripods, but we don't need them anymore because we have the observatory. Instrumentation, the telescope can be used for naked eye observation with a number of different eyepieces. It can be used for astrophotography. We have an adapter where you can mount your cell phone and take pictures with your cell phone. We have electronic cameras that can be used directly to record data. We have the ability to do what's called photometry. We can do what's called spectroscopy. So it's a fairly well-equipped telescope. What it doesn't have is a solar filter, so we can no longer use it for solar observations. That's a project for somebody in the future. But changing this storyline just a little bit, modern days we think of astronomy in the Keeble Observatory and the astrophysics minor and the intro astronomy course is all coming of a package. But astronomy at Randolph-Macon College goes back much, much farther than that. When I first got here, there was the tube for an old telescope that had just been thrown under the observing platform of the observatory. It was kind of beat up. The brass fittings for mounting the eyepiece was there. The objective lens was not there. I found it in the building. Somebody had recognized that probably shouldn't just be thrown under the, so it's a 5 1/4 inch objective lens. It's what's called a refracting telescope. The nameplate on the eyepiece holder says John Byrne, New York. I said, well, that's an interesting old telescope. Some research told me that John Byrne was a telescope builder in New York in the middle to late 1860s, middle to late 1800s. I had really hoped, that I could trace that telescope back to Boydton. The college opened in 1830 in Boydton, Virginia. They moved to Ashland in 1868. Turns out that John Byrne first listed himself in the directory in New York City as a telescope maker in 1863. He wouldn't have built a telescope for Boydton. Besides, in 1863, we were going what some people around here call the recent unpleasantness, and there's no way a Virginia school is going to buy a telescope from the Yankees.
Yeah, we were not really functioning.
Not on speaking terms.
Yeah. Right, not from New York City, right.
But I subsequently learned that in late 1860s, John Byrne had built and delivered a telescope to West Virginia University. And I subsequently, in digging through college catalogs, I found in 1872 the first catalog listing for an astronomy course. It was an upper level course in astronomy, which meant it would have been taught in what we now call the senior year. An interesting notation is that this course is taught partially with the use of an excellent 5 1/4 inch refracting telescope.
That's awesome.
So the Byrne telescope came to the college in 1868 to support the first astronomy course. Astronomy is part of the original liberal arts, part of the so-called quadrivium, which was the foundation courses, which is arithmetic, geometry, maybe algebra, and astronomy.
Very interesting.
The trivium, which is the upper level courses, which is things like rhetoric and dialectic, you were thought to have to have learned something before you could think about rhetoric and dialect and argument. This goes all the way back to Plato's Republic, where he argued that what you need to make philosopher kings. And interestingly enough, before you can even start the quadrivium, you have to teach your children how to move gracefully. Although in Plato's day that meant your young men. Randolph-Macon, as I understand it, was one of the first colleges in the country to require physical education. So there you have the liberal arts. And they didn't have the whole thing until they moved to Ashland. In 1872, the astronomy course had moved from the advanced level to the intermediate level, but it was still taught using a fine 5¼ inch telescope. Interestingly enough, I could find no records of the telescope. I looked in the trustees' minutes. There's no record of the telescope being given to the college. I looked in the treasurer's ledgers. There's no record of the college buying the telescope, so I don't know how it got here. But I know it was here in 1868. And I think it had a wooden tube. The telescope that was sent to West Virginia in the late 1860s had a wooden tube. I've been told it probably had a brass tube. I know that there is a 5¼ inch Byrne telescope at my alma mater, but a brass tube wouldn't have rotted in Virginia, and I think a wooden tube might have because the humidity fluctuates so much.
So you just have the lens. You don't have.
No, the story goes on. Remember, I said I found a telescope body under the observing platform.
Right.
If the telescope tube had deteriorated, it would have been a perfect time. The 1890 catalog celebrates the opening of the new Science Hall. And there are line drawings of that building. It was over on what is now Mary Branch Circle.
Was it Pettyjohn?
It became the Pettyjohn building. He was one of the major donors, but it shows up in the catalog as Science Hall, new Science Hall, with a dedicated observatory on the roof, given by Mrs. Lusk, who was the wife or widow, I'm not sure which, of a trustee. And included in the instrumentation for that observatory was, guess what? A 5¼ inch telescope, which had been worked over, this is a direct quote, by Alvin Clark and Sons. Alvin Clark and Sons were probably the premier telescope builders in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. If you see a picture of a big refracting telescope like the one at the Yerkes Observatory or the one at, pick any large telescope, they built the optics for that, and they may have built the telescope itself. There was a publication put out by the Smithsonian Institution, Alvin Clark and Sons, Artists in Optics, which documents every telescope they either built or worked on. And in there you can find a reference to Alvin Clark working on a John Byrne built telescope. They said 1893. I pushed it back in the catalog to 1890. And then I went and looked again, and I found the treasurer's ledger where in the spring of 1891, there's a ledger entry, $62 to Alvin Clark and Sons for telescope renovation.
Great research.
So it's the Byrne-Clark telescope. And for those who are interested, as the new observatory was going up, we located a telescope restorer who drove down from Pennsylvania, put that beat-up telescope in the back of his van, and came back. He reported to me that the tube was aluminum. That tells me that the tube was replaced again sometime in the 20th century because aluminum would have been prohibitively expensive in the 19th century. You go back even further, there was a time when royalty in Europe when they're having grand state dinners, the truly honored guests got aluminum. The others had to settle for gold and silver. The techniques for making aluminum cheaply are 20th century development. But it's an aluminum telescope too, but it has been restored. It's on display in a case just outside the entrance to the Keeble Observatory, where it outlines the rest of the history of astronomy at the college as well. The Pettyjohn building came down in the 1970s. Wallace Martin, who was in the biology department, told me that he had recovered a cannonball from the rubble. He even had it checked out to make sure it wasn't explosive. And he thought he had collected a Civil War relic. Turns out it wasn't. Here's more research. It was a common practice in the 19th century when you built a telescope dome. If you wanted it to rotate, you would build a cast iron track and you would put cannonballs in the track as ball bearings. So that was part of the ball bearing assembly rotating the dome of the Lusk Observatory.
Oh, that's wonderful. Well,
And that's also in the display.
That's great. Well, Wallace Martin also told me a funny story about Pettyjohn. When he first came, that was then they called it the old science building, but it had been called the new science building, of course, when it was built. But he said the labs, they had to build a new science building because when the trains came by, all the microscopes and all the tables would, shake and tremble. So they were so happy to get a new science building away from the tracks.
Yes. Yeah, the design of the new observatory includes a feature that I insisted on. If you go into the observatory, what you will notice, by the way, the ground floor is storage space for environmental studies. Well, we don't use it. But you can't have any heat in the building. You can't have any air conditioning in the building because it has to stay at ambient temperature. Or remember the conversation about Hibbert and Vaughan and about trying to reduce air currents in telescopes. If the telescope and the dome are not at ambient temperature, it's going to be the effect of looking out over a barbecue. You're going to see all those ripples in the air. So there is a concrete pier that the telescope sits on now that goes down 10 feet into the ground. It anchors the telescope and it doesn't touch the building. There's a gap around that pier on the first floor. Oops, I did that, I wasn't supposed to. There's a gap on the first floor. There's a gap on the second floor. You can stomp on the floor all you want and it won't vibrate the telescope.
That's wonderful.
If sometimes when one of these 2-mile long freights comes through, then you see the vibrations. But it takes a while for them to build up to the point where it messes up your observing.
Well, that's a wonderful legacy of astronomy at the college. And until I saw your exhibit when I went by the observatory the other day, I had no idea that the legacy of astronomy instruction at the college was so old. And that's wonderful that that you carrying on that tradition, and we're still carrying on that tradition.
Peter Rippey was a museum curator in professional life. And when he saw that display with the old telescope, he said, "You could have a career in curation." And I had described what I had done to get all that research out of the archives. I described that to James Scanlon. He says, "You could be a historian."
Absolutely, that research is wonderful, and I love hearing all that.
Although I didn't have quite enough Claritin in my system while I was digging through those old catalogs.
Well, I want to thank you for giving us that history of the observatory, of the details of the building and the telescope and the instruction at the college, and just wanted to give you a chance to summarize any of your perspective on that legacy, that tradition, and what you hope for the future.
I would hope for the future that we're able to sustain the program. I don't know that this should be in the oral history, but I know that it was a disappointment to the department chair, Deanna Woolard, when searching for a replacement after I retired, the college was not willing to commit to a tenure track appointment. And that concerns me a little bit, considering the legacy of astronomy and astrophysics at the college. Without an astronomer on board full-time, you don't have the ability to sustain those programs. And then you go back to maybe just amateur viewing at the observatory once a week for the public, which is still a great public outreach, but gee whiz, you know. And we have alumni from the astrophysics program who have gone on to do graduate work and have gotten PhDs. And one recent student, the resiliency of our students and the resiliency of the astrophysics program, the history and philosophy course has no prerequisites. So even if we've only got a handful of astrophysics students taking the course, there's usually another 10 students taking the course just because it sounds interesting. Mm-hmm. It meets no requirements. Mm-hmm. It's just for fun. Sufficiently just for fun that Mariah and Peter Rippey came and audited it one January.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I remember that when they were here.
But I had a student in that class. Her name was Unity Bowling. She was a junior, double major in communications and women's studies. And she took that class. I distinctly remember her coming to my office one day, and she would come to class alternating between crutches and a wheelchair. By the end of the semester, she was in a wheelchair. And she came to my office and she says, I should probably show you how to use my EpiPen in case I go into a seizure in your class. And I said to Unity, I said, I'll tell you what, you tell the whole class, because there's no guarantee that I will be in the room if you have a seizure. God help us, she never did. But she calmly showed the whole class which pocket in her backpack she kept the EpiPen. She says, there are two. One of them is clearly marked demo. Don't use that one. But I'll show you how it works with the demo pen. And she showed them all how to use the pen, where to stab her in the leg with it, and the class went on. At the end of the semester, Unity, and remember this is a rising senior. She had come to the college wanting to do chemistry as her major. And because of her, I don't know the details of it, but she was losing her ability to walk consistently, and she realized she couldn't complete a chemistry major. So she switched her major to something that she could more easily do. Unity came to me at the end of that course and says, what would it take to do the astrophysics minor? I said, well, you need 2 semesters of physics, 2 semesters of calculus, and you need then the 2 semesters of astrophysics theory, and then you need observational astronomy, and you've already got the history and philosophy down. The summer after her junior year, she took the physics and math courses she needed so she would have the prerequisites to do the upper level astrophysics courses. Wow. And she completed her astrophysics minor in her senior year. When she graduated, she invited me to her graduation party. And I hadn't realized this, but her parents had basically rented the restaurant. It was one of the side rooms, but there was nobody else in the restaurant at the time. It was just her graduation party. And I came in, and she introduced me to her mother, and her mother threw her arms around me and said, "You saved her life." She always had an interest in science and thought she was never going to be able to do it again, and you gave her the ability to do that. She went off she enrolled in a minimum of 2, I knew of 2 graduate programs she enrolled in. She enrolled in a communications course that she could do remotely, and she enrolled in
library science.
She interested in libraries, but she enrolled in a course, it may have been a history course as well, which required her to spend her last semester in Ireland. Mm-hmm. And so she went up to Ireland, and I did get a notice that she had completed that master's degree. I don't know about the others that she enrolled in. And we stay in touch as much as it's possible on Facebook. So Unity was such a neat kid to work with. But that's the way Randolph-Macon students, in my experience, have been over the 35 years I was here. Mm-hmm. I'm still working with a couple. I haven't been able to work with them directly, but I've written a lot of letters of recommendation for students who were still here when who were starting out when I was here.
Well, that's great. Well, that is a wonderful legacy, and you're carrying on a long tradition, and on it goes, and that's really wonderful. Well, Professor Spagna, I want to thank you very much for coming back and telling us all of these wonderful details to have for the record about science education at the college, astronomy in particular, and especially the Keeble Observatory in its 60th anniversary year. So thank you very much.
Thank you for inviting me.